I'd like just to give a few tips. So if you're experiencing a weak internet connection, please turn your video off. And please turn your video off if you don't feel comfortable, because the session will be recorded. So kindly ask you to mute your mic for the session, especially when others are speaking. So I had just to turn the mic off here in this computer. So I wish you and yours are well, healthy, and safe in your countries. Thank you for coming. Thank you for linking in today. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the organizing committee of the 4th Brazilian meeting on research integrity, science, and publication ethics. This is the 6th edition of the event, and it is a joint effort involving researchers from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Fiocruz, Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, in collaboration with others, including PUC-RS and UFG. As many of you know, due to the pandemic, the BRISP was postponed to July 2021, and we are holding a series of virtual sessions as a warm-up for the next year. The first session was held last month, as some of you attended, and the session was collaboratively held with the Brazilian National Academy of Sciences, and the focus of the session was on the role of open science and research integrity to boost public trust in the research results on COVID-19 and inform governmental response considering this fast science environment. As a sort of takeaway message from the speakers for that session, please check the website. It is www.6bris2020.com. As we said in the first session, the first virtual session, research integrity is at the core of many concerns that have been raised in this increasingly fast science environment. And each virtual session will look at this environment from different perspectives. I would like to invite Dr. Carmen Penido from Fiocruz, who is the co-chair of the 6th BRISP, to welcome you all and introduce the second session, which is held collaboratively with the Brazilian Association of Scientific Editors. Please, Carmen.
Thank you, Sonia. And thank you all for linking in today for the second virtual session of BRISP. This session will explore an intriguing topic which focuses on open science, research integrity, and reliable research results in times of COVID-19. What does peer review mean now? We all know that scrutiny of research results may be challenging, especially in this fast science environment. And although everyone in the research community has a role to play, reviewers have been on the spotlight for the responsibility they have in offering reliable advices in these challenging times. So this second session will be moderated by 3 colleagues: Professor Carla Bonan from PUC Rio Grande do Sul, Professor Edson Watanabe from COP UFRJ, which are both program co-chairs of the 6th BRISP, and Professor Edna Frasson from the Federal University of São Paulo, Unifesp, the University of São Paulo, USP, and from ABEC, which she is representing in this meeting. For that, we thank Professor Sigmar Rode, the president of ABEC, for his support. We are also grateful for our colleagues in contributing today, and I will hand it over them now so they give you a quick overview of how the session will work.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, Sonia. And for those of you just joining us, welcome. We'll have 3 panelists for this second virtual session who will share their views on open science, research integrity, and reliable research results in times of COVID-19. What does peer review mean now? Each speaker will have 15 minutes. We will let you know when you have 5 minutes left. After the presentations, we, Carla, Watanabe, and Edna, will make some questions from the committee members and then from the audience. The audience is encouraged to make questions too. Please use the chat box to send your questions directly to Sonia and Carmen. And we are not sure about how many can be answered, and a few questions will be combined. And if time allows, the three speakers will have the opportunity to comment on each one. Please include your name, your graduate program, or your institution when you write your question in the chat. We would like to apologize in advance for any inconvenience. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Glenn Hanson. Glenn is founder and director of the Open Scholarship Initiative, a UN-sponsored global initiative created to help design the future of more open methods of research, publishing, and communication. He is also founder and executive director of the Science Communication Institute, a US-based nonprofit focused on improving the communication that happens inside science. Glenn also served as a senior project manager and institutional review board member with the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, a communications director with the University of Washington, the founder and president of Castle Pacific Publishing Company, managing editor and webmaster at the World Bank Group's International Finance Corporation, associate editor for the Riverside Publishing Company, and a caseworker and field representative for the U.S. House of Representatives. Glenn is also a member of the advisory committee of the 6 BRISP. Glenn, please, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Wow, that's so impressive. I don't think I've ever been so impressively introduced. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this. I think it's a very timely topic, obviously, and I'll try to jump right in here and get started. Can you all see my screen okay? Yeah, okay. So the title of my presentation is Searching for the Right Questions. Essentially, what we have here is it's a complicated topic, and the first step is to disaggregate it into its component parts so that we can understand what it is we're trying to find out. So what do we mean first by these 3 terms: open science, research integrity, and reliable research? Open science, as you may be aware, is a complicated term. It means different things to different people. You could put a publisher, a librarian, and a scientist in the room talking about how they support open science, and in fact they support 3 entirely different things. For some people it means making science more accessible. For others it means making science more replicable, and for others it may have to do with social justice, moral issues, that knowledge belongs to the public, so we should try to make as much of it accessible as possible. So our approaches are different, our definitions are different, and it also varies by field and by region and so on. Research integrity is much more defined. It generally means science that's done well. It's honest and verifiable methods, proper analyses, objective conclusions, and so on. And then reliable science generally tends to have more to do with replicability. Can the results of an experiment be replicated? Is the methodology internally and externally consistent? Are we accurately measuring what we're intending to measure? Colloquially, there's also a perspective to reliability that isn't generally discussed, and that has to do with the reputation of the researcher, the reputation of the institution, and so on. And that plays into the biases that we see in peer review, which we'll discuss later. So how are those three things overlapping? How do they relate to each other? You can make your own Venn diagram, but this is sort of kind of what I came up with here. The point is that when we talk about the intersection of these things, it's important to understand where we're focusing and why, because where we're focusing is going to determine what kind of solutions and what kind of issues that we're focusing on. But for the sake of argument here, we'll talk about this intersection, meaning this is how to improve science. This is how good science is done. So what does peer review have to do with all of this? The general public understands peer review to be a sort of magic bullet that will help protect society from information chaos. It means that scientists have looked at information and determined that it's actual science and good science, and that we can believe in it. And internally, the academic system has bought into this definition as well. You'll see definitions there from libraries that say essentially peer review is an academic term for quality control. You'll see even Elsevier saying that it's a tool for helping people make sense of science claims. So there's a high expectations for what peer review is. And generally, over the last several decades anyway, science really hasn't pushed back on this understanding. There's a great amount of value that's placed on peer review by funders and institutions. There's a value placed on it by scientists. Scientists generally, overwhelmingly actually, hold peer review in very high regard and see it as being important to science. And so to many scientists, then peer review looks like this. And I apologize for the size of the font here, but the slide presentation will be made available to you later too. But it generally means that you have at least 2 outside reviewers, sometimes 3, who are looking at an article, plus the editorial team. It means that a review process typically takes many months, and that's just for the initial review, not the subsequent reviews. It means hours and hours spent on each paper. It's hard to determine exactly how many papers a typical academic reviews, but it could be 5, for example. It varies by field and by the involvement of the researcher. And then it means that on average, about 30% of papers are rejected through the peer review process. So scientists have sort of institutionalized the expectations for peer review and the processes for peer review. And the result has been, between what the public understands and what science understands, that peer review is supposed to filter out bad science. It's supposed to be a quality check, and it's supposed to check the facts. And so when we put peer review into this Venn diagram, where does this leave us? Again, it's hard to know because these 4 terms aren't necessarily related. They have common areas, but we want them to be. We want to know what's at that intersection. That's the question that's being asked here. So, how do these 3 things: open science, reliability, integrity, and peer review, or the 3 items, how do they affect peer review and vice versa? So now we get into the COVID era, which has changed the calculus. Lots of research is happening, lots of papers getting published. There's also lots of misdirection in the research environment, with bad research being done. Retractions are up, lots of junk being published. The Director General of WHO has called it an infodemic. And at the same time, there's a lot of talk in the scholarly communication community about how all of this is a new era in publishing, a new era for openness and demonstrating how important sharing is. We hear things like research can be much more open, and preprints are an important instrument for quickly sharing information, that discovery can move faster with more information being accessible, and that the process right now, the publishing process, is slow and it can move faster. And there's a lot of excitement that this is ushering in a new era in publishing, but we really need to pause and ask whether this is necessarily true. Research can be more open. There was never any doubt about this, but the question has always been, how do we make it more open? And even with the COVID research that we're seeing published now, you don't get everything. There's the data sets aren't necessarily there. The proprietary information on vaccine development isn't necessarily there. There's open in the sense that you know what's happening, but not open in the sense that another researcher could take that research and do something with it. It shows that for preprints that it's an exciting time for preprints, but even still preprints constitute just a fraction of what's getting published. Pre-COVID, it was about 3%. Post-COVID, there's been a crush of papers. I think 5,800 just in bioarchive as of late June, but that's still just a fraction of what gets published every year, which is upwards of 3 million articles. Discovery can move faster, yes. There's no doubt that sharing more information has that potential, but what if we're sharing bad information? Especially when we're talking about cures for illness. Bad information can carry a huge penalty for science. We're proving that the publishing process can move faster. That's true. I think Wiley has reported that its peer review times have been cut almost in half during this period, but is that acceleration sustainable? Lots and lots of effort is being diverted to that, which eventually, if it was to continue out, would translate into higher costs. Is that something that people are willing to pay for? What does it mean with regard to articles that aren't getting the attention that they used to get? We're also hearing that peer review might be affected by this, and that a community-managed peer review is maybe the better model for the future. Something akin to the post-publishing F1000 type of approach, where articles are published and then comments are overlaid onto that. And the answer really, I mean, it's great to experiment with this, but the answer really depends on whether we think that this community management model alone is enough to safeguard the future of reliability and integrity of science. Are we willing to just rely on volunteers and what they think and what they have time to contribute to give that sort of intense direction that we currently get from the peer review process? Is this volunteer process enough to self-police and also to evolve these systems into the future? And then it also depends on whether we really understand what goes into the editing process at present. A lot of, as this audience knows, a lot of what happens editorially is not widely known. It's not publicly known. So are we talking about replacing all of that editorial work and peer review management and so on with just this community process? And finding the right balance in all of this is key. Good publishing practices, good editorial and peer review practices are important in helping maintain research integrity and reliability. And on the other hand, it's possible to publish anything nowadays and publish it without peer review, and that can enable the wrong kinds of outcomes. That especially combined with the pressure to publish quickly in this particular environment. So circling back again, just to focus on peer review, we need change, but we need to determine what kind of change. By itself, peer review is not a good tool for ensuring integrity and reliability. And it really historically has only an awkward and recent connection with open. It's a poorly defined process, really from one publisher to another, from one era to another, defining who is a peer and who is an expert and what do we mean by review. It's very random almost. And the process has typically been closed, single-blinded, and the results not published, although these are changes that are being experimented with. And as you know, the process is slow, expensive, it's biased in a number of ways, inconsistent, and it's lousy at detecting errors. But still, there's trust, right? That we talked about before, trust from the public and trust from science, that peer-reviewed science is somehow better than other science. Statistically, it's not, but we're fighting that sort of perception. And then there's also the fact that different kinds of peer review have proven to be more effective than others. Not all types are created equal. So in fact, long before COVID hit, peer review has been under a lot of pressure to change. Again, evaluating the time involved, the lack of credit, the different types, the evolving issue of faked or cursory peer review that's happening in a lot of especially predatory journals. I'm not going to read all this, but this is from a meeting, one of our meetings in 2016, where a group got together and came up with the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of peer review. It's an interesting read on your own. And then last year, John Tennant, actually it was earlier this year, he published an article on the research priorities for peer review. So again, peer review is poorly defined. These are the highest priority areas where he felt that peer review needed to be clarified. So in summary, square peg in a round hole. Peer review isn't, we think peer review is one thing, but in reality it's something else. And by itself, it's not going to help us meet the COVID era infodemic challenge. So how did all of this happen? That's really the subject of a completely different 2-hour-long presentation. But in general, peer review has evolved, and our understanding of the history of peer review is evolving as well. But peer review has evolved from a system where we typically just refereed occasional papers, with a few exceptions, a few, the Royal Society, for example, but papers were just sporadically refereed, and refereed in the sense that the editorial managers of a journal would send out an article if they didn't understand the science, or if they weren't sure it was actually, if it was too cutting edge, or to help cut down, to help identify which papers were worth publishing. And the referee system then was just to say, of all these 20 papers, these 5 are probably the best. And it's evolved over time. In the mid-50s, as in the Cold War era, when the volume of science, especially in the United States, started to increase dramatically, there were calls for increased accountability in this spending, and government officials started to scrutinize the budgets of the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation more closely, and they wanted answers to whether the money being spent was being spent wisely. In the mid-1970s, this scrutiny came to a head. Congressional hearings in the United States on spending at the National Science Foundation. And this is really where we started to get the idea of peer review. That term didn't even exist until about 1975. And at that point, peer review was repeatedly entered into the record as something different than what it meant before. It didn't exist before, but it supplanted the word referee, and it came to mean that only experts in a field were capable of and should be entrusted with ensuring the quality of science. That concept didn't exist before. It was new, and it was in response to government oversight pressures. And it was only gradually picked up. It took another 10 years after that before other journals started to, outside the United States and outside the English-speaking world, started to adopt that as well. And today we have a huge gap between what this system was originally intended to do and what we now expect it to do. So what do we do now? Do we refine peer review? Do we redefine it? Do we figure out some other way to accomplish what we need to accomplish? The first step is to figure out if there are more precise questions that we can ask, to kind of take the conference theme and twist it around a little bit to see if we can get at it a different way. So, for example, what if we ask, what kind of gatekeeping or referee mechanisms will work best for the future of research? And let's not even call these mechanisms peer review, because our mind is kind of locked into a definition there. What do we need there? How can we share, especially in eras of urgency like today, how can we share large quantities of information more effectively and faster? And then how can we improve and guarantee the reliability of science? So questions like these, they're not necessarily related to each other, and they're certainly not necessarily related to COVID or peer review. The COVID era has highlighted the need to answer these questions, but these are the sorts of approaches that we can take. So quickly then, going over those three areas: gatekeeping, changes that are happening now. We're seeing improved screening of preprints, both internally and social media. It turns out Twitter is playing an important role in helping screen preprints, where researchers will see a study on a preprint server, and then they'll either say this is horrible or this needs to have this done and so forth, and then the authors will go back and revise in real time almost, right, the posting that they made. We're also seeing more efficiencies emerge, as I mentioned, in the peer review process. The question is, are these sustainable and affordable? So what we need perhaps from the gatekeeping question is a better understanding of what we need from these processes, a harder look at what processes are sustainable, and other gatekeeping ideas. One proposed recently, it's an older idea, but the idea of submission fees, for example. Would this help sort of screen out some of the lesser quality things, and also help provide money so that publishers can afford to keep working at the pace they're working now? With regard to sharing, you're aware of many collaborative efforts that have popped up in recent months, different archives for COVID-related research, different collaborations, different initiatives to help support the daylighting of information. Which ones of these will stick around and have influence? And in the evolution of the open science environment, there's been continued pressure to make information more freely accessible. What we need, in addition to these things, are really systems to help us understand what information we need to pay attention to. It's the drinking from a fire hose, probably. We've got a lot of information coming at us. Do we need to pay attention to all of us, or all of it, or are there ways to figure out what information is most salient? We need to still figure out how to have better access to the data. Seeing more journals published isn't really necessarily helping research if the idea is, in COVID research, for example, that we need to have data that's not only accessible but comparable. That's a separate challenge unto itself. And third, we need a better understanding, really, of the needs that are unique to each discipline. Not every discipline has the same needs, so it's important to get at that, and it's also important to grasp the quality versus quantity balance. Just making a whole lot of things more available isn't necessarily, and may even be working at counter purposes to ensuring that what we're viewing is quality. And on the reliability front, what we're seeing now, retractions have been leveling off in recent years, except with regard to COVID research. We're seeing an improved understanding of the need to not sensationalize results. This has been an evolving realization in science over the last several years. And we see a number of initiatives DORA FAIR and so on, registered reports, that are getting more and more traction with regard to improving transparency. What we also need, in addition to those things, is really more of a focus too on experimental design. Reliability has its limits, and peer review is only going to address so many of those. So we need to understand that how we design our experiments and how we analyze our data is more important than those things, than the peer review things. We need to look at the publish or perish pressures in academia, which are more severe in some institutions and in some fields than others, but the common denominator is that the pressure to bury negative findings, to sensationalize your results and so forth, to misinterpret your data, p-hacking, whatever, to only study topics that are high profile and to ignore the issues that are more important in other parts of the world. These all work at counter purposes to producing a body of science that's reliable. And third, we need to continue to focus on understanding the many threats to reliability, such as those, and the best practices that researchers can adopt. So coming up on the conclusion then, we don't need to wait for all this change to happen. It's happening already. Many organizations around the world are already focusing on the role of research journals in society, on different models for sharing and publishing, different and evolving ideas for open access, impact factors, peer review, and many, many other things. But with specific regard to peer review reform, the three things that we should probably do are to think strategically. Again, what do we want peer review to accomplish if we're even calling it peer review? Are we looking for editorial types of work? Are we looking to improve transparency? Are we looking to check facts? Are we looking to referee, just sift out the best of science? Are we looking to avoid government oversight? And so we need to keep something more robust. How does this mesh with the grant review process, which grants are going to continue to have their own requirements and systems? So as a community, we need to identify our goals first and see where we can go from there, rather than just reacting to what's happening in the COVID era. And there is some overlap, but we shouldn't let the COVID pressures direct our strategic thinking. That needs to be a separate argument. The second recommendation is more understanding. We need to better understand what researchers need, and what peer review means, and what types of peer review work best, and so forth. And along those lines, the third recommendation is change. There are many peer review initiatives happening. Let's embrace them. Let's learn from them, and see how this helps develop peer review. There's nothing sacred about peer review as it currently exists. We should work together to encourage it to evolve. And with that, I will pass the microphone back, and I think Michael is going to elaborate on some of these things in more detail.
Okay. Glenn, great. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. Watanabe, could you please introduce Dr. Kalichman?
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to contribute to this session today and help to moderate this session. So let me introduce Michael Kalichman. Dr. Kalichman is founder, director of the University of California, San Diego, UCSD Research Ethics Program in 1997, the San Diego Research Ethics Consortium 2006, and the Ethics Service 2010 for the NIH. CTSA funded San Diego Clinical and Translational Research Institute, and he's co-founding director for the Center for Ethics and Science and Technology, 2004. He leads NIH and NSF-funded research on goals, contents, and methods for teaching research ethics. Internationally, he has had lead roles with representatives of Korea, Taiwan, China, and Japan in setting national research ethics agendas, and is now helping to establish the Asia Pacific Research Integrity, APRI network. He has been a reviewer for manuscripts and grant proposal more than 20 years. Mike, as we usually call him, is member of the advisory committee of this BRISP. Mike, please use your 15 minutes.
I was so clever here. I forgot to turn my microphone on. So, all right, okay. So, thank you. Thank you to Sonia and you and Carmen and everyone who invited me to do this. For the record, I have no expertise in COVID-19 or infectious diseases. I have no expertise really in open science or peer review. I'm interested in all of them. So this request to be part of this panel today gave me a chance to think more deeply about some things that were coming to mind. And so I hope today to follow up on what Glenn teed up for us here, which is this overview of the many challenges, not just acutely because of COVID-19, but chronically, to how we vet science, how we make sure that we are contributing useful information to the future of science. So with that in mind, I'm going to start by saying that my goal here is to look at what is at stake. In a way, Glenn talked about that analysis of peer review where they looked at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Much of his talk was talking about the strengths and weaknesses of what we are dealing with now. I'm going to focus a little bit more specifically on some of the opportunities and threats that are related to what we're facing. And I want to start by going back to the definition that Glenn pulled up about research integrity. Basically, if that's what we're talking about, what does that mean? And this is the first time, thanks to his talk, that I decided to look closely at the NIH definition. And it bears repeating. The use of honest and verifiable methods in proposing, performing, and evaluating research, reporting research results, with particular attention to adherence to rules, regulations, guidelines, and following commonly accepted professional codes or norms. Now, except for that last item, commonly accepted professional codes or norms, which, as you know, vary from time to time and in country to country. If you leave that one out, what you have here is a description of the kinds of research, not just that we value, but the research that was done, for example, in Nazi Germany and Japan during World War II. Their research was, for better or worse, honest, verifiable methods. It had integrity in that sense. So this is why I say, this all is describing research that we can, in a sense, rely on. We can trust the results. We can build on it. But is that enough? And I think of integrity as being a word, back to the Venn diagrams. For me, integrity is a concept that encompasses all of these issues. It is perhaps the largest circle. To have integrity is not just about doing things in a way that's verifiable, but doing things in a way that's right. So part of that is to be respectful, to address the subjects of your research and be sure that we are protecting their rights and welfare. to focus on fairness and justice and how we do our research, to protect the research environment. And there may be many other things you could think of that would fit in that list. So when we say that integrity is at risk, particularly in the face of COVID-19, that integrity is more than just doing research carefully and using the right methods. It's also about how we treat those that we're studying and what we study, how we study it. So what about this larger vision of integrity might be compromised? I've divided this world into two errors, problems that might occur. One is things that we do that are unknowing. We don't even know that we're doing something wrong. And the other is knowingly doing something wrong. In the case of unknowing, sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. Some of you may be aware, a few years ago, a paper was published, I believe, in the journal Nature about experiments where they demonstrated that the gender of the technician in the laboratory who was injecting the mice determined the response of the mice, or as a factor in the response of the mice to what was being injected. Most of us would not have anticipated that the gender of the technician should be a factor, and we still don't know why. And for those of you interested in reproducibility in science, I don't know if that result has been reproduced yet. But sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. Second, and more worrisome, is that there are things that we should have known, but we don't know. We should know how to properly use statistics, how to properly design our experiments, how to appropriately report what we're doing. But not everybody does. Not everybody's well trained in those things. And some people at some level are willfully ignorant. They just think, well, I don't need to worry about that, when they should. So those can be significant problems, even though they are the result of somebody simply not knowing what they should do. In the category of knowing mistakes, one part of this is knowingly doing something that's wrong, but you're doing it because you have hope. And I don't want, especially when we face something like this pandemic, I don't want to discount hope. We want to find something soon and quickly to help us find a path out of what we're now facing. But that hope shouldn't compromise our science. And sometimes it can. But I can easily picture someone absolutely hopeful that the experiment they're working on may be the right answer, and it doesn't quite reach statistical significance, and coming up with a reason to throw out that one data point that will help push them over the hurdle to be able to say, oh, we reached this standard of p less than 0.05. So that's far worse than something that's the result of being unknowing, but at least we can at some level understand why somebody might be choosing to do that. And the second category of knowing is the worst. And I fear that we too much of the time think about this as the definition of the opposite of integrity in science. And that's where somebody knowingly fabricates or falsifies data without really caring whether what they're finding out is true or not. It's horrible. It's arguably at some level evil. But my experience as scientists is that it's relatively rare, as much as we hear about it. So what are the risks that are being increased by COVID-19? Well, the first is the pace of science. Trying to move as quickly as possible definitely increases the risk of committing errors of the type 1A and 1B. If we're trying to move more quickly, there's going to be a lot we don't know, and there's going to be things we should have known, and we're going to make mistakes because of that. And that is one of the costs of moving too quickly. The environment we're in now is a different kettle of fish. It's a different issue. This environment of this concern and this worry and the need to find a result is going to increase the risk of not detecting errors of the second type, of knowingly doing something because you're hopeful, or knowingly doing something in a malicious way. So integrity, the compromise of integrity is at great risk in the face of something like this pandemic. Now, I want to shaped the following by, as I started thinking about this, my first thought was that this isn't different than normal. Despite everything I've said so far, and despite what Glenn said, and despite the meaning of this meeting, we were thinking, well, COVID-19 has made things different. And at some level, it's not different. It's not unusual, for example, for scholars to think, my work is essential and urgent. I found very few scientists who don't think that's the case. And unfortunately, they think that even if neither of those things is true. Not all of us are really doing something that's that essential and urgent, but we didn't need COVID-19 to convince us that we are doing that. So we're already at risk of doing the kinds of things we're talking about today. Second, medical emergencies are not new. I've listed a few here that I'm sure everybody attending this meeting is well aware of that have happened, some of them beginning before this past century, but some of them more recent. In many ways, these are all worldwide. They are in many ways not different. So why are we worrying more about COVID-19? So this is my first thought. We aren't really doing something different. We don't have something different to face here. But then I thought, well, in another way, maybe it is different and it is unusual. And I've underlined you in unusual because as I came up with ideas, I noticed an interesting pattern, which you'll see in a moment. And these have to do with the context we're facing, and that's the public perception. First, the upshot of what we're facing right now is this is some latest data on the worldwide deaths due to COVID-19, which continue to rise, and it's terrifying. I mean, basically, every one of us who can look at a curve like that and see where it's going knows that we aren't done yet, and this is something that is extraordinarily worrisome. The second thing is the ubiquity of what we're facing, that this is a disease that has hit strongly virtually everywhere in the world. Very few places have been spared, and if they've been spared, it's only been nominally, and all indications are it's only temporary at best. This is a disease that continues to spread, and we are all facing it acutely. And this is, even if none of what I'm saying now is true, it's still the public perception that it's true. I would argue that it is true, but nonetheless. Third is the uncertainty about this disease, this extreme of the idea that you never know where you might get the disease from. And if you get the disease, you never know whether you might be one of the lucky people who has no impact whatsoever of the disease, or you could end up suffering greatly, even if you don't die, suffering severe illness and possibly long-term consequences. And that uncertainty about what we're facing is often worse than being certain that I know if I get this disease, this is the result that's going to happen to me. And finally, the level of urgency. Because of everything I've just described, there's an idea that we should have no speed limits. We should be able to move as quickly as possible in order to solve these issues. So the 4 U's, upshot, ubiquity, uncertainty, and urgency, all related to public perception are why this is unusual and different. And I would sort of wrap this up by saying there are consequences of failure here. And those consequences, just to remind us, are number one, that we could be producing something that is not safe. We think we've got the answer, but we don't. And by moving too quickly, we risk pushing something out that in fact is not safe, and people will be injured more severely and more frequently than if they'd gotten the disease itself. There's a risk that it may be safe, but still not have efficacy, and we've wasted time putting something out that isn't valuable. And on top of those, and I think this is extraordinarily important because so much of this is being driven, and perhaps should be driven, by public perceptions, is that failing to abide by standards of safety and scientific rigor during the COVID-19 crisis will fuel the argument that physicians and scientists cannot be trusted. And this is one of our biggest obligations as sort of observers of science and scientists. I hope both are on part of this meeting today. This is our obligation to figure out how to move forward to use science in its best sense rather than risk the rush to try and be first to have something out the door when in fact we risk injuring more people. So sort of following up and concluding on what Glenn had to say, I think there is one positive bit of news here, and that's what can we learn. It's not yet clear what we're going to be learning from all of this. We're in the midst of it. It's going to be easier 10 years from now to look back and see what we did learn. But this is a forced opportunity to experiment with things like open science, alternative peer review mechanisms, and I would go further, as Glenn was pointing out, to think out of the box, alternative ways to vet science, to figure out where we should go, and also given back to the perception of the community about science and where we are. Our methods of communicating with non-scientists are extremely problematic. We have not done a good job. We need to do better. And that's where I will conclude. So thank you and obrigado.
Thank you. Obrigado. I have some question for you, but I will write your email next week, probably.
Okay.
Okay. And so we have to move to the third presentation, but by Dr. Marcelo Boza. And I would like to ask Edna to introduce Dr. Boza, please.
Okay, Atanab, my pleasure. But before doing this, I would like to take this opportunity to say on behalf of the Brazilian Association of Scientific Editors, ABEC Brazil, that it is also an honor for us to join you today and contribute to this session. We look forward to meeting you again soon in the ABEC meeting, Live 2020 in September, and collaboratively with the 6th BRISP in December. Thank you, Sonia, Carmen, and all the colleagues in the organizing committee. Now, let me introduce Dr. Marcelo Boza. Dr. Boza is a full professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and former research fellow at Harvard School of Public Health and a scholar at Fulbright at New York University School of Medicine. He was Secretary General of the Brazilian Society of Immunology and received the Cap Sorbonne Chair to teach and do research at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris in 2016. He is member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences and reviewer for Circulation, Blood, INAS, eLife, PLOS Pathogen, FASEB journals, and others. Marcelo is member of the Advisory Committee of the 6th BRISP. Marcelo, please, your turn now.
I want to thank you. I want to thank the organizers and say that it's an honor to be here. And I will touch in some of the aspects that Glenn and Michael brought today in a very beautiful way. And it's, of course, it's not exactly my subject, but I will try to bring some issues that I think that might be important to discuss again. So this is the painting, the triumph of that, and I think that somehow the urgency that we are going through now is it's related to the possibility to block this triumph, and this, as was so well presented by both Glenn and Michael, has some very positive aspects and some very dangerous as well. So the point that was just made by Michael, it's also something that I totally agree. If we look the history of humanity, we see many moments that we have important infections, and especially if we look for certain diseases that are not in this time frame. But if we look tuberculosis, malaria, and AIDS, in 2018, we have more than 1 million deaths of tuberculosis unrelated to AIDS. And this number is even higher if we consider the ones that were also HIV positive. And malaria, we have 400,000 a year. And AIDS, actually, we can somehow estimate the total number of deaths. And this is around 32 million deaths. So as was discussed, I mean, there are reasons for the urgency, but also we need to think that many other diseases are still there and they are somehow urgent. And now I bring a little bit to the immunology point of view, in the sense that many of these issues that are in discussion today are related to the immune system. And it's beautiful to see what Thucydides proposed, and he made incredible observations, and he was not a doctor. He was someone devoted to history. And so he observed that the sick and dying individuals would receive compassion and care from the people that experienced the disease before, because they knew that they would have never had the disease again. But he also made several observations showing that the disease moved with the troops, that at Athens was not the only place where the disease was, and somehow changing the idea that the disease was a divine, a type of thing against Athens. But then we go on, and in China in the 10th century, the immunization to protect people from smallpox. And of course, the study of Edward Jenner that used lesions from cowpox to immunize against smallpox. And it's interesting to observe that in these 3 cases, we didn't even had the idea that the disease were caused by pathogens. And this idea only came in the 19th century by Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur. And then also in the 19th century, we start to have an idea that antibodies might play a critical role controlling disease and so on. And now we are under this massive wave of different things. I mean, massive waves of publication, massive waves of people getting sick and in a different way, because compared to the other disease that we just discussed, like tuberculosis, malaria, somehow there is the perception that, as Michael mentioned, it can be very dangerous in one hand, but there is the perception that the vaccine is right there. So there is this idea that at any time we might have a cure, we might have a vaccine, and that these 2 poles can be somehow disruptive. If we now look at the clinical trials and the publications, we get stunned. Like we now, from January to July, we are talking about 4,000 clinical studies, clinical trials. And if we look publications up to the end of May, we are talking about 40,000 publications. And in July this year, we had almost 70,000 articles and 20,000 preprints. And that's an important point, as Glenn mentioned. So it's not the majority of articles or manuscripts are preprints. I mean, the majorities are actually articles. And here it comes some important points. So this study is analyze the different studies, the different clinical trials. And as you can see here, there are several important points, and if we really go to the bottom, when we analyze these different studies that are in the base of the clinical trials government, we ended up seeing that a minority are a placebo-controlled blinded studies. And if we really go to the bottom, I mean, as the authors state, so even before results are known, most studies likely will not meaningful a scientific evidence at a time when rapid generation of high quality knowledge is critical. So they will be meaningful. So the point is, are we doing the right design, and is that a central issue in the discussion, I think. So, and these other study analyzing the articles that have been published in the first 3 months of the pandemic, they also show that almost the 50% are secondary articles, and the vast majority of the human studies and the medical research were observational studies and case reports, and only one were randomized controlled trials. So most of the studies, are at least half of them, were secondary articles. And this is interesting when compared to H1N1 pandemic. And at this point, after 3 months, when this study analyzed the publications, suggests that the majority of the early publication on COVID does not provide new information. And that's something we should have in mind. So then there is this issue that Glenn brought to us about the tools that can help us to deal with this condition. And he also mentioned, and I just show you that, the perception that we had a major problem because of a preprints, it's not the case. I mean, most of the studies have been actually published as articles, and so the author proposed related to this massive amount of research that, and we saw actually happening, the paper collections that were curated, similar to a sort of like art gallery or art museum that we have curators. So we saw that in different journals, and this work has been very important, and we have friends at different journals that have been doing this very important work. But also we saw initiatives of search tools using artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to analyze this huge number of articles. And one would think that this artificial intelligence that has been used to analyze the current articles that are produced, they eventually would be used as a filter related to the peer review. One would think that might happen soon. And one point that is also astonishing is the fact that the COVID papers published these years are getting 10 times as many attention per article as all scientific publications during the first 5 months of 2019. So like the 12 highest scoring scientific articles ever are about COVID-19. So those numbers are sort of shocking. And as Michael mentioned, so there is this issue of the perception of the society and the communication of research as well. And here it comes more like to the center of the subject that we have been discussing today. So it's not the preprints, it doesn't seem to be the preprints the problem. So it might be the problem or issue here is the fact that we have been publishing in a very fast pace. So if I don't have a pointer here, but if we look the first curve, the darkest one, so the darkest one is related to the articles published on COVID in 2020. And as you can see, the purple line means 7 days. So the majority, like 59% of the articles on COVID-19 were reviewed and eventually accepted in 7 days. And the two other curves are related to articles in the same journals in which the COVID-19 papers have been published in 2019 in the gray and in the dark gray and in the light gray in the 2020, including the COVID-19 papers. So as you can see, there is a great difference in terms of pace. It is true that some of the journals that have been publishing COVID-19 papers have fast track, and we have some of the numbers here showing that. So it's interesting, but exactly how is the editorial process associated with this pace, it's not clear. So that's one point that would be interesting to consider, actually to know better what are the exact mechanisms associated with acceptance of those manuscripts. So there is, of course, concerns about the quality of those manuscripts that were accepted in 7 days. So in my personal perspective, the peer review process, sometimes it's hard, it's suffering, but in general, I could see the work becoming better. And I think that's an interesting point. So is it possible to do any change when your article is accepted in 7 days? Any improvement? So regarding this specific point of peer review and analysis of the publication, so there are these authors made some very interesting proposals, and so considering the standards for a editorial work and that would maintain the quality even during these emergencies when you have a different pace. And this second point, I think, is very, very important. And I think that is something we should consider to have in our PhD programs. And it's something that I will propose, is to have a peer reviewers trained. So what I have been thinking is that this could be something that we should start during the PhD process. So during the courses of PhD, we should bring people to do like case-based learning associated to peer review. So to put our students to start training peer reviewing. And so prioritize funding, maintenance, and access to literature database and search engine. I think that is an important point. And maintain and invest in in the further development of curate database. And I think that's, again, a very important point. And as the author states, these should not rely only on private sector. So we really need to have public funding that will guarantee the independence of those curation process. And I think that if we think like in the reevaluation of the process, so is it interesting and possible in a time frame to analyze the evaluation that was made and how the different articles were analyzed and how they actually stand the pressure and the time. So is it possible so I think that these are going to be an interesting point in the future, looking back to what's happened during the COVID-19 response. So this is an interesting experience. So this is an experience made by Daniel Acuna from Syracuse University. So he used a software. So he developed a software to identify images that eventually have been duplicated. And he found in few hours 400 potential duplicated images. And of course, some of these findings seems to be true and some are actually not. It was not confirmed. And now this type of a testing is going to be carried out, and one of his proposals that he will make contact with the people to which the authors that had been identified using this program. So, but then so this author, Mark O'Brien, he makes an interesting point. So are we doing everything wrong, or is science still working as it should? So I think that's an important point. So retraction are still rare. So it's a very small number. But then it comes important points like the chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, a paper on Lancet, how the investigation or the clinical trial that has been carried out by World Health Organization. So you see the impact. And of course, the fact that it came from Lancet and it came from prestigious authors made a major impact. So in that sense, to have the brand of those journals can, of course, it is very important in a sense, but also can be misleading. So I think that that's something to think about. And the process of science generally takes place below the radar of public awareness. And in this case specifically, it's very interesting because the public has been paying close attention. And as he mentioned, for the first time, the public can see how the process is going on. And, despite the retractions, I think that medical science, and the authors state that the medical science has been very successful over the long run. And I think that part of the conditions of doing research in general and the process of being revising what the work that has been done. So I would like to finish with this idea and from Stephen Jay Gould. I think that science is very important. Of course, I do science, and I totally consider science an important human endeavor. But I think that we need to really consider that we are not so special in a sense. So we are part of the society, and to have science respected. I think that science needs to be understood. I think that is critical during this time and in the future to have a good communication and to have trust and that would be the way to have science as something that bring at least some light to society. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. This topic is really intriguing and delicate at the same time. As we had mentioned, we have a few questions from the committee for you and for some others that have been collected from the audience. So the audience, please can put your questions in the chat, including your name, your graduate program, and your institution when you write your question, please. So our first question for you, I think Mike may start, but the other of you are most welcome to comment on. So we have some context here. A recent paper entitled "The Perfect Moral Storm: Diverse Ethical Considerations in the COVID-19 Pandemic" explores several ethical challenges in current attempts to increase the scientific knowledge of COVID-19. On the research record, these authors comment that while there is advantage of having preprints disseminating relevant findings quickly, the value of that information may be undermined by errors and mistakes that peer review would normally, if imperfectly, correct. So our question is, do you think traditional pre-publication peer review has played any role to strengthen the reliability of COVID-19 research?
Well, the simple answer is yes. I mean, it's what we have, and it is valuable. And a peer reviewer can, if they spend the time, sort through a lot of the questions that we're worried about. At this point, it's probably good to mention something Glenn pointed out that I agree with strongly to an extent, which is that in some ways we should worry more about the design and the statistics questions than the peer review. But there is a role for good peer reviewers to take a look at what is the design of this study and what are statistical methods. So my simple answer to that would be it has a role. Yes, peer review has a role. So I'm going to stop there.
Oh, any more comments?
Can I jump in on what Michael said? Oh, can you hear me okay? It says I'm muted.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No, following up on what Michael said, and we've discussed this in other parts, but I think it was in the Wiley article that you noted in the question. It was mentioned that one of the possible outcomes of all this is that participation in peer review will increase, that more and more scientists are volunteering to participate in peer review right now because they know it's important and needed. And so over the long term, maybe this would be helpful for the process that more people will be involved. Peer review has absolutely played an important role in what we've, in the information that's come out, and the efficiency of it has increased, at least over the short term, during this process. So again, what we talked about before, whether this efficiency increase is sustainable is the $64,000 question.
Oh,
yeah, I would. Okay. May I add to their positions? So I think that the idea of a more transparency in the peer review process, I think it's an important one. And I think that, well, I mean, some journals also include the peer review process and documents in the journal, in the articles. And I think, or at least the possibility to see that. And I think that might be an important thing to study and to understand. And I think that more journals should use the transparency of the peer review process. Not necessarily the reviewer, but the process itself. I think that would be important.
Yes. Okay. So thank you all for these insights. Watanabe, could please make the next question?
Okay, Carla. So this question has also some context, which I think it is good for all of us here to have a broader view of the issue at this point. Okay, moving to the question. Commenting on peer review in the era of COVID-19, Michael Willis from Wiley writes that peer review speed and quality need not be in conflict. This seems to be consistent with the initiative Rapid Review COVID-19. This is RRC-19. And this RRC-19 is an open access overlay journal that seeks to accelerate peer review of COVID-related research, preprints, and prevent the dissemination of false or misleading scientific news. They say that editors are committed to both disciplinary and geographic breadth and take care not only to source manuscript from all regions, but also to include board members and reviews from all regions. The question is, do you think initiative like this will shape views on open peer review and signed review reports in the near future? I think this is the second question. I think Marcelo may start, but as in the previous question, the other two also can make some comments. Marcelo.
Yeah, I think that I will let Glenn go with this one. I think really it's Glenn. Please, would you go ahead and?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to read what I wrote because I don't want to leave anything out. It's just 2 sentences, but the short answer I think is that time will tell. Right. This particular effort, if I'm understanding the effort correctly, and I've looked at it, and I'm not sure I grasp what they're trying to do, but basically they're trying to peer review everything, and it's just not scalable. You can't have a small group of people peer reviewing everything. It's just too labor intensive to expect that to happen. And it's also way beyond the scope of what's practical. One group can't be expert on everything. So they're trying to be sort of a global editorial board. And I apologize if I'm misunderstanding what they're trying to do. But more broadly, though, that there are many organizations that are working on these issues, and they're experimenting with different kinds of peer review. And there are pros and cons to all the different kinds of approaches. Open peer review isn't necessarily superior to closed peer review. There's people who feel that there's certain risks to doing it that way. So there doesn't necessarily need to end up being just one right kind of peer review, and it's going to vary by different fields that come up with different solutions. So. Michael, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Or?
Yeah, a couple of things. So the first is that independent of what they're doing in this particular case, I think the premise that we might learn about the values of open peer review or options, this gets back to the point I made in my slides. I think this is an opportunity for some experiments that are going to be heavily in the eye, I hope, of the scientific community. And we have an opportunity to, because people are looking so intently and so closely, to see what might be possible and what has problems, and if we identify the problems, to solve them. So that's to the good side of this. The whole concept of peer review, though, is one that I think, I don't know how many people on the call have written papers and reviewed papers, and have been an editor of a journal. I've had the opportunity as an associate editor in the first two, to see the process. And what I know is that the current system is that a lot of people don't agree to review when asked to do so. And that when they do review, that they do so often after a month or 6 weeks. But it's not that they took them a month or 6 weeks to do the review. They finally do the review after being hounded to do so in the last few hours of the last day that they finally turn it in. So there's clearly an opportunity there to speed the process up. If people felt the urgency to do that review that they were going to do in 6 weeks today, then it would be done sooner. But the other problem in this, maybe this question go back to Glenn, because he may know the numbers on this. He talked about, on average, how many papers people review. But it would be interesting to look at how many publications are coming out per year and how many scientists theoretically should be reviewing those papers, and then dividing that number and see how many reviews we need per person. And my sense is that most researchers don't recognize that if they don't review as many papers per year as they try and publish, and that includes having to repeatedly try and publish the paper, then they aren't reviewing enough. So how far off the mark are we? Do you know, Glenn?
It varies a lot. I'm just laughing because your dog made a surprise appearance in the
background. Yes, that's my collaborator here who will answer any questions I can't answer is Stella. So she's helping.
I don't know the answer. I was trying to find that myself. It varies a lot by field, obviously, right? There are some fields that are so narrow, there's only 5 people in the world who are even able to review a paper. So those 5 are going to get a lot of work depending on how much is published.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. But anyway, I think the short answer is I think far too many scientists are getting a free ride. And I've heard the suggestion that maybe scientists should all be required to review as many papers as they get published. And if they don't, they can't get the next paper published. I'm being somewhat facetious about that.
It's kind of implicit, isn't it, though? Because if you, I think, who was it that suggested there's sort of a vicious circle that takes place, or a virtuous circle, where if you're getting a grant from NIH and you've reviewed research for NIH, it's sort of incestuous. It feeds on itself. You're more likely to get a grant if you've reviewed a grant. You know the people, and so it's sort of implied that you should be active in the peer review process if you want to be successful at grants.
But somehow I agree with you, Michael, about, it seems that there is overall an exaggeration of articles anyway. It's something that interesting to think about, like in everyone's careers. Is it essential to publish so many articles? I mean, is that the point? I mean, the quality of your own production, it's something that we would need to reconsider. So we are discussing more like the end point, like the peer review process and the article we're going to go or not. And also, as Glenn mentioned, now we have like so many journals that, you're going to publish in the end. And is that the case, or really to work? And that, again, it goes into the subject of integrity. Like, it's not really something global. It's also like, it's your own career. Like, how do you think you would do better to society, in the academic field you are working with? I think that we have been publishing things that might not deserve to be even done in a certain sense. But again,
if I could follow up on that really quickly, I don't want to take too much time. Yeah, you can have a whole other conference talking about not just which type of peer review is good, right? Open versus closed, blind, double blind, whatever, but also getting credit for peer review. There's quite a movement to take a deeper look at that. And if the workloads of peer review are increasing so much, there seems to be a lot of push for scientists then to be recognized in some respect for that. And then some people who say, well, if you do that, are you making sort of perverse incentives whereby scientists are reviewing because they're going to get credit instead of reviewing because it's good for science. It's a very interesting tangent to go on.
Okay, thank you for this sharing your perspective, and we are all parts of this problem and the communication of science, and it's a real challenge, not only for authors, but for reviews and for the public at large. So I would like to ask Edna if she can go ahead with the next question.
Sure, Watanabe, thank you. And it is closely connected to what you have just said. When it comes to research integrity, what strengths and weaknesses do you see on having COVID-19 research results readily available to the public without undergoing formal traditional peer review? Perhaps, Glenn, could you start?
None. I mean, the question is, what benefit is there to having the public see science that hasn't undergone any kind of quality control? And there isn't any. It's just a recipe for disaster. But it's still, you argue, well, science belongs to the public. Let the science go out and let the people make the choice. Let them talk about it on Twitter. But in reality, what we see is that the press will take something, and I'm not bashing the press. It's their job to try to go through and make sense. But oftentimes, it's the mandate is different. Scientists will be able to look at a pile of non-peer-reviewed papers and say, this is good, this is bad, this needs more work, whatever. And the public will go, wow, hydroxychloroquine is going to cure, right? And so I don't see any good coming out of that, personally.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna try and be the devil's advocate here and try and make a case, because I think there's a little bit of a case to say that there is a strength to just put it all out there. Now, when I say put it all out there, there's some level of decision that somebody is making. Some scientist somewhere has to decide that he or she is going to put this up on a website or make it available. So there is at least a little bit of filtering. But whatever that is, what might be the advantage of that? And one advantage is that if we don't do it, it sounds like we're hiding what we're doing. And perhaps what we should be looking at, instead of saying, should we do this, we should be saying, how can we do this? How can we do this? And perhaps take it as an opportunity to better help this public to understand what science is, how it works, why it's a slow, difficult process. And I'm not thinking we're going to convince everybody, because science has become one more political football, but at least some people, and maybe the next generation, will have a better appreciation for how science works. So that's a possible strength.
I agree with you completely, and my job is to try to figure out how to make open science a reality in the future. My concern is that intersection between science and the public. Making science more readily available to other scientists is a different question than making it all available to the public. And if it was a format whereby the public better understood that this is science in progress, and this is science that's being refined, and this is science that's been proved, that's maybe a helpful paradigm to think of it. But I agree with what you're saying, Michael.
Yeah, it's interesting to see it. Like I think that the preprint should be seen as something different than an article that has been published through peer review in a way. And this is, again, part of the communication process about science. And in a way, as a scientist, somehow, when I look at preprint and when I look at a study at Lancet or New England, in subconscious, I would consider that the New England and the Lancet is something good, and the preprint is something that really needs more concern. And that's also, interesting to see that, very bad articles have been published recently on Lancet and New England Journal, and they went through peer review. And they had this label that they came from prestigious journals and from prestigious groups. So that also can be misleading. But if we know that the preprint didn't pass the filter of quality, I think that's something. It could be a different look. So I think that journalists, society would need to look in a different way anyway, and as we should do as well as scientists.
Marcel, let me read you one quick quote from, speaking of the Lancet, it's the editor-in-chief of the Lancet said about this publishing in the COVID age. He said, basically, we feel very much that we are publishing research that is literally day by day guiding the national and global response to this virus. And that is both daunting and full of considerable responsibility, because if we make a mistake in judgment about what we publish, that could have a dangerous impact on the course of the pandemic. So I think along the lines of what you're saying, we're also in an era where we're reevaluating what role journals play in helping in informing society.
Well, thank you for your comments. Now we are running short of time, but we have some questions from the audience, and I have to ask the first one. It comes from Claude Permus, the Fiocruz. We saw incredible high number of papers during the Zika epidemics, and now the same phenomenon in COVID. Number of articles published plus peer review plus impact factor are well established indicators to judge the quality of research. Do you think it had an influence in the number of these papers? Is it possible to change these cultures amongst editors, project financiers? Well,
I'm going to jump in now because I've got an answer, because maybe we could get a little bit of clarification because I might have missed something. So that the COVID-19 circumstance, the pandemic, has influenced editors to be more willing to publish things more quickly without enough effective peer review. Is that, have I missed the point, do you think? Or
yes, the point, I think it's because the journal is influenced, the impact factor is important, is high. So how do you think it had an influence in the number of this paper? And how we have to judge the quality of our research using this.
I'm going to take that as an opportunity to bash journal impact factor and say how terrible it is. Yes, it is possible that some editors, even unconsciously, this would be an example of doing something out of, they're not thinking about what they're doing, but to realize, if I publish this, I'm going to get a lot of citations within the next 2 years, and our impact factor is going to go up. I think it's hard. There's a conflict of interest there, and that's unavoidable. I don't know how much of this, what percentage of the rush to publish is due to that, but I can imagine that that's a factor. And I'm against that. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. We have more questions.
Another? Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, no.
Please.
I don't have anything substantive to add to that. I agree. I think Claude, when we were at the SciELO 20 conference, I think the audience was almost booing every time the word impact factor was mentioned. So there seems to be a lot of hatred about that. But at the same time, the publishers need to have some sort of a metric. But what metric is a different question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. We have another question from Clarissa Monteiro, from Biological Chemistry Program, Institute of Medical Biochemistry, Leopoldo de Meis. Clarissa asks how to identify and separate the different causes, and more important, how to avoid before publication submission. And now a thought that came to me now. Part of the answer to my questions above could be with all these COVID issues, explaining COVID is pushing to more and faster publications that gives the fear or failure in coping with the integrity. But would the high visibility and scrutiny by both the scientific and public communities inhibit and push the scientists at least try to do it correctly? Do you think
I'm not sure I am understanding the question either. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the point is she asks if the high visibility of, for example, of preprints by scientific and public communities, and I think also for the publications, may inhibit the scientists to do something wrong, or to at least to do it correctly, to do the best, for example.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a deep question too. There's always a tension, right? There's a tension between, as both Michael and Marcelo were alluding to, between doing research with integrity and doing it thoroughly, and then having that bias, whether it's an unconscious bias or sometimes it's a deliberate bias. More rarely, but then compounded by the fact that there's an urgent need to find answers, and a pressure to publish, and a race to find cures and so forth. And it's a sort of a toxic mix of factors that are sort of inevitably probably going to lead to a lot of sloppy science, whether it's preprints or published in a journal that wants to be the first to publish the groundbreaking study. It's a difficult time for integrity.
Yeah, but I think that Clarissa touches in a point that is interesting, like to be in the very spotlight, and again, maybe the Lancet, the famous Lancet paper, because it was about chloroquine, and there was all this political issue associated, got much attention, and it's interesting to see that this study was retracted after 13 days, and the autism study, it was retracted after 12 years. So it's interesting to see, and I think that you have a point, Clarissa, and of course, whenever the study, it's more in the front and it's more into the spotlight, the crazy people that might do studies and science without integrity eventually will be catch. I mean, there is no way science is like this. I mean, if the study was not well done, it might take months, it might take years, but one day that will not gonna stand. The guy eventually might be dead, but the study will not stand anymore. And that's an important thing we should somehow discuss with society and with our students. I mean, it's important to understand that, the research will be there forever in a sense, and for scrutiny of the community, of the society and the scientists.
I really like the direction of Clarissa's question and Glenn and Marcelo's answers, because it's suggesting to me another way of thinking about what's happening. Instead of being horrified about the number of papers that have come out that are problematic and have had to be retracted, and people are pointing it out, we should perhaps be impressed with this is another mechanism of doing science, another way of doing things to say, let's just, that's what science is about. It isn't dependent on what an individual does. It's a matter of what happens collectively. So if we are all doing our best, trying to get it out there, we don't want to be found out to be problematic. So as Clarissa is saying, there's that scrutiny that's going to be there. And that scrutiny may very well not need years, as Marcelo suggested, but may need days or hours in some cases before somebody will say, wait a minute, you missed this important point.
And the balance point there, of course, is Marcelo was basically alluding to the Wakefield study. What happens when somebody says that there's a link between autism and vaccines, and then you have a whole generation of parents who won't vaccinate their kids, and it's all because of a bad study that took 12 years to be retracted.
But if it had been in this environment, then the entire scientific community would have come down on it immediately, and it might have been retracted within days or weeks.
Maybe, right? Unless it gets sort of caught in that reputation cycle that we're all subject to, right? Came from a good researcher, from a good institution. It was peer reviewed, published in a good journal. So why are we going to question that it was true?
Thank you.
Okay. I think we can move to the next question. It came from Ximena Ilyarandi. I think it's her name. And she wrote, I think the Equator Network guidelines have been very useful in improving the quality of published papers. Do you think that similar guideline to aid of the peer review process could be useful?
Yeah, Equator is doing great work, and there's many organizations that have endeavored to improve the quality of peer review and published editorial guidelines, and it's also very institution and discipline specific. So I don't know if it's possible to, and publisher specific. I don't know if it's possible necessarily to have a universal best practices. But it's certainly worth continuing to experiment and figure out what works and what doesn't. And there's just so much we still don't know.
See, another way, I think guideline documents like that are useful not because they're the final word, but because they could be an excellent teaching tool, a starting point for discussion. So you can say, here's some things that people have said we should do. Do you see something on here that looks reasonable? Does it resonate with you? Does it not? What's missing? What looks wrong? That conversation would strengthen what we do. And getting back to, I think it was Glenn and maybe Marcelo talked about this some too, is the importance of teaching people to be good peer reviewers. Why isn't that an important part of what it means to train a scientist? It isn't just about them publishing their own work. It's about their role as being a member of the community and being able to evaluate the work of others in a useful way.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point, and I think that our PhD programs should really start doing that right away. And at this moment, we have the opportunity to bring people from everywhere through the internet and learn from them. And we know great scientists that have been dedicating a good time on peer reviewing, and they do very well. I mean, it's something that we need to take advantage of this knowledge and to teach to our students and ourselves. I mean, it's a changing world anyway, so we are always learning, and I think that, you know, getting bad papers and discussing the bad papers, getting the good papers, discussing them, and doing this type of case work, I think that would be a very important point, because otherwise the machines are going to do it. So I think that we should do right. Otherwise the machines are going to take us from this work. And that can be interesting, a challenge, but it can be very dangerous as well.
I think supporting what both of you said, the sentiments are very are universal. Most scientists, most researchers want more training in peer review. Sense About Science and Elsevier did a survey a couple of years ago about researcher attitudes about peer review, and the desire for more training and more clarity was a vast majority.
I have just one compliment for this question by Ximena. She wrote later. It has been out in the news that some of the vaccine were already in phase 4 studies. Journalists are craving for news and use these bad articles. Have you thought of producing guidelines for journalists to help them choose from all the available data?
We're working on something something like that in OSI to help journalists understand what preprint is versus a peer-reviewed journal. But other organizations, yes, have produced infographics for journalists. They're just not really widely read. I don't know, Michael or Marcelo, if you've heard of any other wide-scale initiatives to educate journalists about this.
I have not, but still, I think that that's a great opportunity. There is no parallel in history of maybe, we are really in the moment that everyone is discussing issues related to immunity, treatment, vaccine, disease, not disease, why child are not very sick, why old people are sick. So there are so many intriguing and fascinating questions. I don't think that we should be afraid of everything. So I think that that's an opportunity to make science something that is possible to discuss, to talk about, and to be more of the general public. And for that, I think that this initiative is very important. The journalists should be part of the game. So we need really to talk and to have a careful discussions about what the results means and what you cannot really consider out of that data and so on. So I think that's an important issue. And again, it's a great opportunity.
Unfortunately, right, as we all know, journalism is shrinking. It's been under financial pressure for years, and science journalism has been cut in so many places. It's harder and harder to communicate science news to the public. I would add, Michael, that you had the U's in your presentation. There's also another U happening in today's society, the ubiquity of information on the internet. It's so easy for people to get their news from so many places, and a lot of it isn't real, and the news that they need to hear from actual journalists is often paywalled, and the budgets are shrinking. So it's hard. The need for information is up. The capacity to provide reliable information is under a lot of pressure.
So we are running out. Now we have just the last question. It's from Thomas Craig. It's about artificial intelligence. Anyways, artificial intelligence is already being used in scientific publishing. For example, identifying new reviewers, fighting plagiarism, bad reporting, bad statistics. But do you foresee that artificial intelligence can also be used to harm?
And I'm not sure what happened, but as you were talking, your microphone, suddenly you went silent after you think artificial intelligence could be used. So I'm not sure what happened there. Or maybe if there might be something wrong with your microphone.
Edna, você está sem microfone.
Uh-oh. does somebody else have the question? Maybe we
Edna, I can make the question.
Okay, thank you. Now I have.
Edna, we can hear you.
Okay.
But it's better. It's better because sometimes.
Okay. Artificial intelligence is already being used in scientific publishing, for example, identifying new reviewers, fighting plagiarism, bad reporting, bad statistics. But do you foresee that artificial intelligence can also be used to harm, for the lack of a better word, research integrity? There is already a book that was fully written using an artificial intelligence algorithm, and last week, a blog created using an open source artificial intelligence software reached a great number of readers. Specifically, do you think people will take ownership over papers and data created by artificial intelligence?
Well, I'll answer to the general issue that do I think artificial intelligence, a tool that's out there, could be misused? The answer is yes. And that's the answer for any tool. So that wouldn't surprise me. However, as scientists and observers of science, we should be cognizant of the fact that artificial intelligence is not some sort of a black and white switch or on-off switch where now we've got it, now we don't. It's an evolving field where people are trying to find ways to mimic the ability of the human brain to do things. And if we can get it to do that well, it can do it very fast. Right now, we are on track to be able to do a lot of things very badly, but very fast. So you can create errors or misinformation or whatever else it is very quickly. So in that sense, the answer is yes, we are at risk the way artificial intelligence will be used.
Okay, I think we are almost finishing. So, but still I have one question from Jonas. I forgot his surname, but Jonas. The question is, how can we boost the science communication about research integrity to the public? Maybe just one could comment on this. I was smuggling one of my question. Do you believe the fast-tracking process for COVID papers helped to save life or to kill people? Okay.
I'll take the science communication one. I think work like what Sonia is doing, teaching a new generation of students how to use science communication and the importance of it, what it means, that's critical. I wish that there were more programs like that at the university level that taught not just researchers, but students from every stripe what science means, how it's developed, how we should interpret it, and so on. That definitely has a role to play, but there's not enough attention that's paid to it by funders, by governments. That's a continuing battle. Maybe what comes out of this crisis is that there will be more attention paid to that need.
Okay.
Well, related to your question, it's hard to tell. I mean, I think that both things happen. And in the end, in the future, maybe in 2 or 3 years, we would have a possibility to realize these figures, but it's not a trivial thing. I mean, we have very bad politicals in our world. I mean, in Brazil and US, and they are not helping in that sense. So the science.
Yeah, but I think we have to keep this in mind. Okay. I think Carla can.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's a real pity not be able to extend such inspiring session. As Watanabe has said, we are experiencing challenging times in science for academia itself and for society as a whole. We will continue to address research integrity in this context, and we really hope the sessions will be available and help foster best research practice and publication ethics in our institutions. As program co-chairs of the sixth BRISP, it has been fantastic to work with the co-chairs, Sonia and Carmen, and all the colleagues in the organizing committee.
So can we have some final words?
Yes, please, Sonia, some final words. Thank you.
So thank you for this outstanding session. I loved it. It was fantastic, this discussion. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the points raised. An enormous thank you to the panelists and all of you who linked in today. And many thanks to our audience for, enriching the session, and look forward for the 3rd in September. So we'll let you know. Thank you. Carmen, please, your final words.
I also want to thank you all, my colleagues, for this amazing panel. It was really, really, really nice. So that's it. I hope you stay healthy and safe. And I hope to see you at our next meeting in September. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, all.
Enjoyed
Bye-bye.
the conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
See you.
All right.